Okay, so our second work session this morning, also of great importance and personal interest, especially to Sue and I, for different reasons, perhaps, but maybe the same reasons, although I don't own a farm. So Legacy Lands Farm Conservation, and you're going to take this on off too, Kevin?
Yes. Good morning, Council. For the record, Kevin Tyler, Lands Manager with Clark County Public Works, and here with me today is Danielle Cowley, our Lands Coordinator. We're following up on a previous discussion about farm conservation, and we're going to give you a brief overview about a framework for farmland conservation easements in Legacy Lands, and we're seeking your feedback today. Next slide, please. Our goals this morning are to talk about that framework for farmland conservation. So we'll talk to you about how we adopted a watershed-oriented strategy across all project types within the Legacy Lands program, and how we identify and locate conservation priorities for farmland in the county. We want to talk about our strategy for outreach to landowners and discuss some of the responsibilities and components of farmland conservation easements. And then lastly, we wanted to discuss how we see the budget unfolding for farm conservation projects in this program. Next slide. So, through the earlier adoption of the Natural Areas Acquisition Plan, which was in 2022, and the guidance manual following that in 2023, we have shifted our acquisition strategy to focus on being more flexible and approaching conservation options by watershed sub-area. This flexibility on an annual basis allows us to prioritize any of the conservation options, whether that's farmland, wetland and habitat areas, streams, greenways, forest conservation, any of those options, depending on available land and willing landowners and available budget. And so this map figure shows that there are 10 major watersheds in the county, and then those are broken up into sub-areas. So, for example, the East Fork Lewis River would have an upper and a lower, and Salmon Creek as well, an upper and a lower, so that there would be more like 20 to 22, I think, sub-areas. Next slide.
Danielle Cowley, Parks and Lands, for the record. As you see in front of you, in the fall of 2020, Clark Conservation District identified agricultural properties in Clark County. The areas in color showcase the agricultural properties anywhere from 5 to 80 plus acres in the county. In 2020, the USDA Agricultural Census identified over 1,900 farms in Clark County, totaling 56,000+ acres. Conservation easements will focus on agricultural overlay, the urban growth boundary, and the prime agricultural soils. We would target larger parcels, R5 and R10, and the zoning with that within and outside of the urban growth boundary. And we would like to prevent fragmentation risks, since it's better with them locked up sort of as neighbors together. Conservation easements involve willing sellers, willing buyers for the transactions. The fee simple title of the land is retained by the owner. A permit restriction is placed on the land to retain it in open space for farm purposes. The county holds the easement while the landowner retains the flexibility for selling and leasing the property to another farmer. The goal here is to maintain farmland for long-term use, and these lands wouldn't allow for public access, but would have an annual monitoring component to confirm the intent of the farm easement remaining in effect. outreach can be the most challenging, as we've been told. There is often misunderstandings for conservation easements with farmers sometimes, and we would like to build trust with the agricultural community, creating a farm ambassadors or landowners who have worked with us through the program. And then timelines, as we know, for acquisitions are sometimes longer than some landowners prefer. To support this, we're going to develop education brochures about conservation easements with the farm community. Additionally, county staff will attend farm meetings with conservation districts, farm bureaus, or other local agricultural community members, and there may even be more opportunities. We have met with 2 farmers this year to talk about 25 projects for 2025 acquisition projects. And we would appreciate any input additionally that you might see that we need to do outreach on for incorporating, that we should incorporate into the plan. Next slide. Typically, typical requirements placed on a landowner with the farm easement include preparing and monitoring against a farm plan. The county will conduct appraisals, review appraisals of the development right value along with the other necessary due diligence. Easements typically offer flexibility such as allowing land to go fallow and make changes to agricultural practices. And then the county would also carry out the annual inspections of the easements.
This slide shows the proposed 2025 to 2030 capital plan projects for legacy lands. As you know, the Washington Farmland Trust has been working on a project with us. They anticipate closing on that project in fall of this year. And the location and owner of the farm will be announced as soon as that purchase and sale agreement is signed. As we've talked about, we're shifting our acquisition strategy to focus these different conservation options on a watershed basis and working with willing landowners. And so as we look at the capital plan, we have a second project identified for next year in 2025 around the same value, about $500,000. And as Danielle mentioned, we've started some initial outreach on that project. And then because of the number of pre-existing projects in 25 and 26, we don't have anything additional until 27. So then from 27 to 30, this is when the flexibility of the watershed approach strategy kicks in. So each sub-basin, depending on development pressure and willing farm owner and budget, could provide a potential candidate project through those 4 years of the plan. And this could be amended through the 2025 supplemental budget if council directed that. Next slide. So as I mentioned, our current project is roughly about 20 acres. I think it's 23 acres, and the value is close to $500,000. 2025 and 27 through 30 could support a similar size project each year. Projects that would be larger than 20 acres potentially could be more expensive, so that we couldn't afford one every year. Smaller projects, you could potentially do more than one a year. Again, it depends on the size, the development pressure, and the zoning, so the closer you are to higher density residential development potential, the greater the value. So essentially we're looking at this, and our recommendation would be allowed to, in order to maintain flexibility for other project types and other entities like cities are eligible for Conservation Futures funding and nonprofit organizations like the Columbia Land Trust and Washington Farmland Trust. In order to provide flexibility for those types of projects and other county projects, our recommendation would to not do more than $500,000 annually for farm conservation purposes in the 6-year plan. So that's kind of how the annual budget amount, as we see it playing out. The areas of interest, as Danielle mentioned, so we're looking at primarily outside the urban growth boundary, but that could be inside the urban growth boundary. If we looked at that figure from earlier in the presentation, that's that band of that band of the county between Vancouver and its urban growth boundary, and then the outlying cities like Ridgefield, Battleground, and East County, where existing farms occur, R10, R5 zoning, agricultural zoning, and then agricultural and soils that support agriculture. So that's how we would focus farm conservation easements in terms of the areas of interest. And then lastly, flexibility, and what we mean by this is how closely you monitor and regulate a conservation easement. So on one end of it, as we've been learning from our partners, you have tools like a right of first refusal that you would pay extra money for, that would give you the right to purchase the property within the first 10 years. That's limited at 10 years due to Washington state law. In that 10 years, if the landlord decides they want to sell, then the county would hold a right of first refusal. And that's to prevent things that the Farmland Trust is seeing occurring in other counties where you record this conservation easement. It prevents it from further subdivision of the property in the future, but it doesn't prevent somebody from buying it and turning it into just an estate, stop farming, and it becomes open space at that point. So while we've talked about the easement would allow for flexibility of changing agricultural types, growing different produce, going fallow for a few seasons, it wouldn't prevent from something like this happening, where 10 years down the road, or less than 10 years down the road, somebody sells the property and a new owner comes in and says, I don't want to farm, and so I'm not going to farm, and what tools do we have in place to prevent that from happening? And so on the strong end, we would have some tools in place to regulate that. On the other end of things, you allow for that flexibility. It goes into open space. It can't be subdivided. Maybe 20 to 30 years down the road, the property sells again, and it can be put back into agriculture, but it can't be subdivided. So we're looking for council's input on how much flexibility and how strongly to regulate those conservation easements. Next slide, please. So in terms of next steps, we're looking for your guidance today on annual budget amount to allocate towards projects, if we're missing anything in terms of how we engage with the community and farmers, and then, as I mentioned, some of those aspects about how strongly we protect conservation easements, understanding that the more restrictions and regulations you put into the conservation easement, the more it's going to cost. The right of first refusal, for example, the right of first refusal that adds $120,000 to the project that we're currently working on. So that's about a 20% increase. And so that's all that we have today. We'd like to hear your thoughts and answer any questions that you have.
Once again, what I'd like to do is just start with Karen. Do you have questions or comments? And then we'll get to the guidance part.
I do have a couple of questions before getting into the questions that you ask us. One is that there were, in that one slide that listed all of the various projects, there were a couple of East Fork projects listed. And I was curious what their relationship is to the reconnection project that we just heard about in detail?
So let me refresh my memory, but so we're looking at a couple of projects potentially upstream of the Daybreak area. One is in what we call the Lewis River Ranch area, which is just on the other side of State Route 503 from Louisville Park, so just downstream. The county acquired some property from the Lewis River Ranch property owner a decade or more ago, and we're looking at a phase 2 of that project. And then the other one is a little bit further down. It's closer to the end of the project footprint, and that is near Daybreak Regional Park. So we're actively engaging with landowners in those two locations. So the relationship to that, just the relationship to that project is that they're nearby.
And will it involve the waterways at all?
It would involve acquiring riverfront property, and that's it at this point.
I see. Good. My second question involves that one project listed for Vancouver that was on the Columbia River. What is that all about?
A few years ago, the city of Vancouver gave the county a proposal for acquisition of property on the Columbia River near 192nd. And that project was recommended by the Parks Advisory Board for inclusion in the plan, and has been listed in our capital plan for at least 3 or 4 years now. We're still waiting for the city to come to us with a timeline for when that would be acquired. I think they recently purchased the right of first refusal. So they're engaging with the landowner, and we would come to the council with a project agreement at the time when the city's ready to purchase the property. If they're not ready to purchase the property in a few more years, it'll likely drop off the list.
Thank you.
Okay, and that concludes your questions, Karen. Thank you.
Yes, it does.
Sue?
Thank you. Thank you for putting together a framework for the ag acquisitions, because I felt that a well-meaning from a previous council to set aside a chunk of money for the purpose. There was no context really for figuring out prioritizing and things like that. So this is very helpful. I'd like to better understand the last points you made related to if a property owner has a conservation easement and then decides to sell. And so we've invested in purchasing the conservation easement. Is that investment then just lost if they decide to do something else with the land later? I'm a little confused about it.
Yeah, so the county would acquire the development rights, and so the easement prevents the further subdivision of the property from, to allow for more development. It also prevents the construction of additional structures. So if someone were to stop farming, it would essentially become fallow open space at that point. But I think we would potentially be limited in how we regulate or require them to keep farming. So those are the struggles that we're wrestling with recently, is how do you, after a certain period of time, and we're doing annual monitoring on these easements, how do you make sure that someone continues to farm? I don't think the investment would be lost because it would still be considered open space. It wouldn't be developed, and there's still the potential in the future that someone could acquire it and farm it, or that owner could choose to lease it and farm it, but there's the risk that it goes into a status of non-farming for a period of time.
Okay, and so then the question would be whether it would be of value to us to have that right of first refusal to purchase the whole thing, and then the county would have to decide whether or not they wanted to do the farming on the property.
Correct, or,
Right.
or lease it out to a farmer. And again, the right of first refusal is only a period of 10 years. And we'll be looking, as we learn more about this, we're looking to more and more tools that are available for how we make sure that people continue to farm, because that's the intent.
Okay, I understand now. And in terms of the budget, I think that, you know, the farmland will have different criteria than a natural area.
Mhm.
And, you know, and there's a limited pot of money, and so it's good to, I think, have a designated amount that you'd want to put into farmland protection, so it's not as much competing with, because I think they're two different things, and you look for different things. There could be overlapping benefits, for sure, but it's good to have a separate pot of money. And I think since we're kind of testing the waters on the interest in the community to participate in something like this, I think it would be good to, because 500,000 really doesn't get you a whole lot, to have the flexibility, if there is interest, to revisit that. I think right now, maybe 500,000 is a good place saver, but to have some flexibility depending on the outreach. And then I think collaborating with partners like the Conservation District. I know they have done, I think they did a mailing some years ago and have done a heat map related to looking for areas that, you know, where you have more of the active farming and the soils and things like that. And so I think all of this is really great. Good to see this going forward. I do think there are other tools, though, for protecting farmland or grants and ways to leverage dollars and build collaborations, just as you have with the natural areas. So those would be good to explore as well. And I do think, you know, when I look at farmland around our farm, I think the most vulnerable farmland is land that's designated Ag 20. It has the Ag 20 overlay, but it's already parcelized. So it may look like you've got acres of farmland that's being actively farmed, but it's just maybe a matter of time. The current farmer passing away and the family then selling off what could be several 5-acre parcels. So I think that's some of the most vulnerable, best farmland that's out there. And if there's strategies to aggregate, if we can aggregate farmland, that would be a good thing to explore as well. So those are just some of my thoughts. And thank you for your work on this.
So I don't want this to be misconstrued, but it needs to be said. Obviously, I've been championing something like this my whole tenure here. And Sue, your input is very valuable. The issue, though, becomes one of conflict of interest. You've already announced it. You have a farm. So setting priorities between zones, natural areas, active farms, budget amounts, those are all areas that you have a conflict of interest as far as giving guidance and taking votes on. We only have 3 people here today. And so what I'm suggesting is we need all 5, because one of them has to recuse themselves on the guidance moving forward. So as far as seeking guidance, I think you really need to have a separate session where we have the full council present so we can talk about budget and priorities to get over any issue of potential conflict or actual conflict of interest. So I do have some specific areas of concern. I have always had them. And just based on some of what I have seen out in the communities, and one that I came from was Northern California. It was prime winery country. Really expensive land, really
wealthy, what I would call land barons. I mean, hundreds of acres, thousands of acres of prime winery land in winery use, open space. And I saw the county spend precious conservation dollars conserving those wineries as wineries, when none of those properties ever had any interest whatsoever in doing any development or anything whatsoever, and the public got no access. They got to look at the open, many hundreds of acres of winery. I thought that was just a giveaway of cash, of millions of dollars of precious conservation future money to landowners that had absolutely no incentive or interest in doing anything different with their land anyway. So that's a caution. That's something, how do we avoid that trap? On the other hand, you mentioned, well, if we're going to buy a right to first refusal, and you put, well, that's expensive, this is how much it costs. I would rather think of it in terms of, well, what will the market bear? I want to be the poor person on the block saying, if you want to keep your farm as a farm, and it is absolutely in the best public interest to do this, what are you willing to accept to constrain your individual property rights, and set that at the lowest possible value? So to your question on what I would like to see in the future, if we get to it before the end of my tenure, and I'm hoping we do, what is the interest out there? We have, I've heard an amalgam of stories out there from, hey, I've had this farm 100 years, or I've been in forestry for 100 years. I would like to subdivide my property so my kids can live here. And then we run into zoning issues and subdivision issues, and that becomes an impediment. The other part of that is none of my kids want a forest. None of my kids want a farm. This property is valuable. This is my life plan on retirement. I would like to now sell and subdivide it. This is America. We're not a communist state. We're not a Marxist socialist state. And it's natural for all the neighbors to go up in arms, and we're seeing it now in the Hawkinson area and other developments on the fringe of East Vancouver and Camas in Clark County. Neighbors, it's a natural thing. Hey, I like looking at the farm. I bought this house 20 years ago because the farm was here. But they don't own it. And they don't have a right to tell their neighbor what they can do with it. And so it's a collision of public policy issues. And we see it all the time. But for me, this program is really the only way to move forward in a democracy where we don't basically take the rights of landowners away and tell them what they can and can't do. I mean, we do that enough with zoning. We do that enough with permitted uses and conditional uses. We do that enough. So this is a way where we can get a property owner who may be on the edge of surviving with their farm or timber or whatever their business, their agricultural related business is. This is a way where we can say, this is a way to help you stay afloat. This is a way to keep our open space and keep our farming intact. So I don't know what the right dollar amount is for the budget. I would like to know what the interest is out in the community. And again, I don't want to enrich people unjustly at the expense of other taxpayers. So as far as watching it, regulating it, I think we need to assiduously do that or claw back all the money we invested. I think that's important and a fiduciary responsibility we have to our other taxpayers. The last, that map was phenomenal with all the red parcels and the statistic of 1,900 farms. I mean, that was phenomenal. and we could spend weeks focusing on each section of that map and the different watershed areas. I do, to highlight my concerns again, and to ask you some questions on what collaboration is going on, because you mentioned collaboration with the city and the project down on 192nd and the river. Here's another example, because it is at the intersection of amazing development going on right now. East Vancouver, Camas, Clark County. The urban growth boundary is right there. And we have tremendous pressure on the 192nd corridor, but Camas is robustly developing. And we have some residential development, and Harmony is right there. You know, there's so much going on. There's a confluence of development. The Johnson Dairy Farm was one of those big red blotches. It was outside the urban growth boundary until Camas incorporated it. So I'm kind of curious, was there any discussion with Camas on, hey, we have 200 acre of precious farmland close into that urban pressure development that you were mentioning? What collaboration, hey, city, maybe we can help conserve some of this. I don't know what discussion there was. I don't even know if the farm's been sold yet, but I do know that they now have the North Shore development with industrial, commercial, and residential all being implanted in that corridor. So that would be a great place to conserve if we could afford to do it, and if anyone had an interest to do it. And I know the Johnsons, and I know that, you know, they've been in dairy industry for generations, but they're tired and they're done, and they don't like equestrian uses. They're not looking to develop a park. They have a right to sell their property at top dollar. So I guess my focus is, what is the coordination that's going on with the cities? I mean, how robust is it? Why have we, I mean, I have the same question when I first saw that conservation potential when it was up on the priority list on the Columbia River within the city of Vancouver. I'm like, why are we conserving this? But anyway, could you just touch on what is the level of collaboration? Is anything being spoken with the North Shore development? I know that we could have that discussion throughout that entire map that you showed, but could you focus on that?
Yeah, so those are really good points and good questions. The coordination with the cities and the other organizations that are eligible for Conservation Futures funding has been, you know, we've been trying to intentionally engage with those organizations more recently. When we updated the guidance manual, we made sure to reach out to all of them to solicit their feedback on how we're adjusting the program. And then we are planning to do what we call it a call for projects, right? It's to reach out to all those entities and say we're accepting proposals for projects next year. That's the idea, is to, and, you know, we don't tell them what their priorities are, but they tell us what's important to them. So for Vancouver, that was an important project a few years ago, and Fenton Park acquisition was another one that was important for the city. We've worked with the city of Camas on multiple acquisitions around Lacamas, and but we haven't talked very much about the North Shore development that you're mentioning, and we haven't engaged with the cities regarding farmland specifically. You know, we've focused more on the conservation organizations like the Conservation District, Washington Farmland Trust, others similar to that. But that's a good point that, you know, we've been engaging with the cities on just that they're eligible for funding and looking at them to tell us what their priorities are. So I think we can do more of that engagement moving forward. But we've spent time meeting with each of the cities during the guidance manual update.
Councilor Marshall.
Yes, thanks. I think that's a good point to coordinate with the cities because there could be a strategy to have some green belt between some of the cities as everyone expands out. But just to clarify, since you brought up, and I had mentioned earlier, potential conflict because we are seeking a conservation easement. And we had already, with our farm, aggregated the farmland. It had been 3 10-acre parcels, so it took a bit of money and time to be able to carve off a 1-acre parcel for our home and then aggregate. So we have 27 acres of agricultural land that brings it more in. It's legal and compliant now as far as the Ag 20 designation. So that's a done deal. And whether or not there could be any funding for our conservation, I don't know. But we're seeking to donate initially because it's our desire to have our farm as a farm in perpetuity, and whether or not it's our children that are farming or anyone in our family that are farming that land, that it would be continuous farmland. So I have a good deal of interest in this topic and hope that I'd be able to have some input, and whether, if there is an actual conflict that arises, I'll be sure and mention that.
So here's how I'd like to end this, and kind of a question to you and the manager. Have you had one-on-ones with each of the counselors on this? So maybe, especially with the 2 that weren't able to attend today, I would recommend that. And then I really think we need to put this on for maybe separate business so we can get the input of all 5 to answer the question on budget amount, targets, and amount of regulation, if you will, or supervision of those easements, so they do have a clear way forward from the entirety of the council. That's the first issue. So what would be your input on that?
I think just because this is a work session and there's not final action being taken, that maybe we just do a 10-minute work session before the next one to get that feedback from council. So it's during a work session piece, not council time.
Yeah, and so I appreciate the fact that you're in this position as someone seeking the benefit, but it is an awkward position to be in because pretty much any guidance you give could be seen as, well, that may benefit Councilor Marshall's plan to seek a conservation easement. I mean, you just have to be really mindful of that. So it wasn't meant at all about any criticism. I mean, it is just, we have to be mindful of at least appearances, whether it's actually becomes a conflict at some point or indirectly becomes a conflict. It's always the potential, and then even beyond the potential, it's the appearance of a conflict. So
I'm happy to be totally transparent about what we're up to with our farm and conservation easements and agricultural interests in general.
So the other point, I mentioned that as far as setting dollar amounts on what easements are worth to the public and how much we're willing to spend on it, I just want to again highlight an example of where I thought we had a great public-private conservation project, which was the Cedars and the family there, the Coleman's. They really gave up a lot. I mean, they essentially donated a lot of value when they agreed to that sale for the conservation effort. It could have, most of their property, other than that was restricted by protected lands, could have all been homes. I mean, they could have gotten top dollar by selling to developers, and so it was their altruistic contribution to the greater public good that kept the price more reasonable for the county. So that's what I'm hoping to cultivate as a way ahead as part of our budgeting process, that we're looking for those people that have these farms that want to keep farming, that want to keep it open, but really want to help the public in perpetuity, and they're willing to
do it at least cost to the county, if you will. I just wanted to highlight that just to further explain what I was trying to explain.
Thank you, Counselor. Those are all really good points. And I think I just want to add a couple of items. So that's part of what you're discussing is what's so great about the flexibility of how we move the program in a certain direction. That's, we see a range of interest. We see people who they want to sell conservation property, but they want to get what's the fair market value for it. And then we see some that are interested in a legacy and they're willing to contribute through donation a portion of that value. And then we see on the other end folks that just they're willing to donate outright. So it's all about the willingness of the landowner, and there's that flexibility in the program where if we do find a project that's of significant conservation value, like the Jolma property, that there's an opportunity to amend the capital plan through the budgeting process twice annually, where we can shift and change priorities, and that'll be up to council to make that decision. And then the last thing I want to say is you asked about interest, and so we're starting to engage with a few farmers, and there are some that we've heard there's interest, and then there's some that find value in this. They say this would be a good program to do, but not for me, right? So I think there's just a range of people and their interest level, and the more that we can educate and get a few of these successfully under our belt, the better off we're going to be.
Okay, well, I certainly appreciate, and I think you touched on all the relevant issues and have a good plan in place, and I want to end on anything that Councilor Marshall said as far as guidance. I agreed with. I mean, there's nothing I disagree with. And I think we have a way ahead to move this forward, because I'm really hopeful that this is a great way ahead. And it will at least satisfy some of the itch in some of the neighborhoods that we know we're going to have green space. We're going to do our best to protect farms, open space, as much as we possibly can without condemning someone's right to their own property and telling them what they have to do with it. I mean, that's a policy collision in a free market. And of course, we have building interests, and they're always voraciously looking for appropriate areas to build, and we need homes. I mean, we need thousands and thousands of homes, more. Anything further? Otherwise, I think that does it for our work sessions. We'll be back in session at 1. Anything further? Aaron, anything?
Not for me.
Okay, we'll go. Thanks for the presentation. We stand adjourned.